The Battle of Plataea, an ancient Greek city in 479 BC, is best known for being one of the most decisive battles of the Greco-Persian Wars. A clash where the Greeks decisively beat back the mighty Persian Empire and began their long process of kicking them out of Europe. The Persians would never successfully invade Greece again. But it was also a really bloody battle. And while the Greek victory was decisive, it came at a cost. We have fairly good numbers for the Spartans involved in the battle, because Spartan King Leonidas sent back to Sparta with 200 pairs of brothers after the battle to show off their glorious victory. In total, 320 Spartans were lost at Plataea, about 10% of their force. But for the other Greek states involved, we're not so sure. Plutarch tells us that 7,000 Athenians died at Plataea, but that number might be too high. Thucydides has a much lower estimate. For the Argives, Plutarch says 1,000 fell in battle, but again, he may be mistaken. For the rest of the Greeks, our sources are silent. So what exact troop numbers do modern historians accept for Plataea? That's what we'll investigate today. It's me. Welcome to my channel, where I bring you new videos every week on ancient history. To answer this question properly, we need to first talk about the sources we have for the battle itself. We have three main sources for the battle: Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plutarch. Herodotus's and Thucydides' histories are well known. They were both historians from Athens who wrote down their respective versions of major events in Greek history. Herodotus's work is generally considered to be less reliable and more nationalistic than Thucydides, though whether or not that's true is still hotly debated. To make matters even more complicated, Herodotus never actually wrote anything about the Battle of Plataea. He stops his narrative right after the Battle of Mycale. So all of the numbers we find in Herodotus about Plataea are actually from secondary sources. And what's worse, in some cases they contradict each other. Plutarch was a biographer from Athens who lived during the early Roman Empire. His work contains a lot of valuable information for the ancient Greek world, but he too can be problematic. While he tries to present himself as a historian writing in a neutral and objective way, he often succumbs to Athenian bias and sometimes straight-up lies. For example, he claims that the Aeginetans were driven out of their city by the Athenians, which is flat-out wrong. For a deeper analysis of Plutarch's flaws as a historian, check out this video here. Finally, there is Thucydides. Thucydides wrote about the Greco-Persian Wars, focusing mainly on the Athenian side. His history is considered to be the most reliable source we have on the subject, but it should be noted that he only covers events up until 411 BC. He therefore doesn't cover the end of the war, and consequently he also doesn't cover Plataea. But luckily for us, he does have a speech, where he lists how many troops every ally of Athens had to send to the Delian League treasury every year. This list is called the muster of ships, and it's the closest thing we have to official numbers for the forces of the various Greek states. The first step in answering our question is therefore to figure out how many troops each state involved in the battle sent to the Delian League. Now it should be said that just because a state contributed X amount of troops to the Delian League doesn't mean that all of those troops were available during the Battle of Plataea. Some of them might have been too old or too young or otherwise unavailable. But we don't have any other reliable numbers for the troop strength of these states, and so this will have to do. We know that Sparta sent 700 pairs of brothers to fight at Plataea, totaling 1,400 men. The 200 pairs of brothers who came back with King Leonidas after the battle means that 320 Spartans died at Plataea, about 10 of their force. We also know that the Argives sent 1,000 heavy infantry to the battle. How many exactly that means is debatable, but more on that later. For now, we'll just assume it's 1,000 men. For the Corinthians, we're told that 120 pairs of brothers went to the battle, totaling 240 men. Then there were the Megarians, who sent 100 men. The Laons sent 50 men, and the Boeotians 50 as well. These numbers all come directly from Herodotus, but there is no reason to doubt them. Even if you think Herodotus is unreliable, these numbers are also confirmed by Plutarch. When it comes to Athens, we actually have two different numbers. Herodotus writes that 7,000 Athenians died at Plataea, which makes sense because Athens was a democracy, and thus had a lot of citizens who could fight. However, Thucydides says that Athens only sent 1,000 hoplites to the battle. Hoplite being the type of heavily armed infantry that was common in ancient Greece at the time. There is no reason to doubt either of these numbers. Thucydides' speech was probably given at a time when Athens still felt confident and powerful, and thus he wouldn't want to scare people away by talking about how expensive it would be to equip 7,000 hoplites. Herodotus, however, wrote after the defeat at Aegospotami, where the Athenians lost almost their entire navy and control over the Aegean Sea. After this disaster, Athens had much fewer resources, and it makes sense that he would be undercounting how many troops Athens sent to Plataea. Now, the interesting thing is that all of these numbers add up to about 3,600 troops. If we then add the 2,000 Spartans and 1,000 Thespians, we get 6,600. And that is despite me assuming that the 1,000 Argives, and the 240 Corinthians, and the 50 Boeotians, and the 50 Ilians were all hoplites like the Athenians. If we assume that they were all just regular foot soldiers instead, then the number would go up to 7,800 men. Herodotus clearly states that the combined Greek force was 6,400 strong, and he gets that number by counting every pair of brothers fighting for Sparta as for men. According to him, this is how the number breaks down. 7,000 Athenians, 1,400 Spartans, 1,000 Argives, 240 Corinthians, 100 Megarians, 50 Ilians, and 50 Boeotians. However, these numbers don't quite add up. There are several problems here. First, Herodotus counted every pair of brothers in Sparta as for men instead of two. Now, I'm no mathematician, but if we take the 7,000 Athenians and bring them down to 1,000, the numbers start to look a lot better. The total number of troops at Plataea would be about 9,400, exactly what we expect. And the number of heavy infantry would be about 5,400, which is exactly what we have. Furthermore, this also fixes the problem that we have two different numbers for the Athenian contribution. We can now say that Thucydides meant 1,000 hoplites while Herodotus meant 7,000 total troops. If we then take the numbers of Spartans, Argives, Corinthians, Megarians, Ilians and Boeotians from Herodotus and combine them with the 1,000 Athenian hoplites and add the 3,000 reinforcements who made it to the battlefield, we arrive at 9,400 men. Of those, 5,400 were heavy infantry and 4,000 were light infantry or other troops. Not bad. So that's what we have. Those are the troop numbers that modern historians generally accept for the Battle of Plataea. But it is important to remember that these numbers are rough estimates based on partial accounts and some educated guessing. We simply don't have any official records of the battle, and the ancient sources we do have are not always reliable. For example, we don't know what the Corinthians were doing at Plataea. Were they 240 hoplites like the Athenians and Spartans, or were they just regular foot soldiers? Still, I hope you learned something today. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing for more content. And as always, a huge thank you goes out to my patrons. Thank you for watching. Until next time. Today we're answering the question, which Greek city-states had the most important role at Plataea? This is my channel. In this series, we look at some of the biggest battles in the ancient world to see which side would win if they fought today. To answer this question, we need to first ask another. Who even fought at Plataea? Because it turns out quite a few states had troops there, but only a handful really mattered. So let's meet the main players. On the one side were the Spartans, along with their allies, the Argives, the Thespians, and the Athenians. And on the other were the invading Persians, along with their allies, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Cimmerians, and the Carians. It might not be obvious why these particular city-states were involved, so let's look at what they each got out of fighting for their respective sides. The Spartans, of course, were the dominant power in the Peloponnese, and they sent 700 men to the battle, including elite units of Helot soldiers called Perioikoi. who were allowed some rights and privileges in return for their military service, as well as some helots who were forced to serve without any rights at all. Sparta was very much the powerhouse of this war, and they sent their best troops to ensure victory. They were also eager to show their dominance over the other members of the Peloponnesian League, which included the Argives, who also sent 700 men to the battle, as well as the Thespians, who arrived late but still managed to send 200 men into battle. These two city-states were small compared to Sparta, and so by supporting Sparta, they hoped to get some of that reflected glory. Plus, both had good reasons to fear Persian aggression. Thebes had been sacked by Persia just a generation before the battle, and Argos had good reason to fear the same fate. So siding with Sparta, the most powerful state in the region, made a lot of sense. Athens, however, was a different story. You see, while Athens wasn't anywhere near Plataea, they did have a strong incentive to stop the Persians from winning. Why? Because just 5 years earlier, the Persians had launched a massive invasion of their own into Attica, sacking the city and destroying its walls. And many Athenians felt that without their help against the Persians, the rest of Greece might fall one by one until the Persian king was sitting on the throne of every Greek city-state. This wouldn't do, of course, so Athens sent 200 men to join the Spartan force. But that isn't all. You see, Athens was heavily reliant on trade and imports for food. But when the Persians invaded Attica, they cut off Athenian shipping. As a result, the Athenians had no choice but to flee to safer parts of Greece, leaving behind the harvest that would normally sustain them through the winter. Since they couldn't eat what they left behind, Athens asked their ally Megara if they could use their farms instead. But Megara refused, probably because Megara was currently at war with Athens and didn't feel too bad about letting them starve. So naturally, Athens turned to the Spartans, who granted them access to Laconian agriculture in exchange for 30 talents of silver. So thanks to this agreement, Athens not only had a place to grow food, but they also had another reason to fight alongside the Spartans. But what about the opposing team? Well, the Persians were obviously the big guns here, boasting a force of 6,000 men, twice as large as the Greeks. The vast majority of these were foreign mercenaries, which meant that their loyalty depended on how much gold the Persian king was willing to pay them. The main group of mercenaries were the Syrians, who numbered around 2,000 men. And they were led by a man named Udi, who will become quite famous during the battle. There is little to say about the Syrians except that they were veterans of many campaigns across the Middle East and Western Asia. But that doesn't tell us why they chose to invade Greece or why they decided to follow their commander into battle. For that, we can look at Herodotus's account of the battle, where he gives us an answer that surprised me. As the story goes, Eutyche was a friend of Gyges, the tyrant of Lydia. And when Gyges died, Eutyche took his widow back to Assyria. Now, shortly after his return, a herald arrived asking him to either lead an army to help the Lydians recover an altar that had been stolen from Sardis, or to pay 40 talents of silver in compensation. However, Herodotus tells us that Eutyche laughed at this request because he didn't think any money in the world was worth sacrificing his friends. And so he set out for Lydia with an army to retrieve the altar. But after traveling through Thrace, he found the Greeks already occupying the altar and guarding it. He therefore challenged them to a contest to determine who would take possession of it. And the Spartans accepted. The terms of the contest were simple. Each side would appoint 5 pairs of boxers to fight. The first pair to win 3 fights would take the prize. And since the Greeks were outnumbered, they agreed that if they won, the altar would be returned to them. If the Spartans lost, however, they would have to pay 100 talents of silver instead. And so the contest went on for 9 days with the Spartans winning 7 of them. But then something miraculous happened. A Spartan named Chionis was knocked down and about to lose his fight when he suddenly remembered his family's prayers that none of them should die at the altar of the gods. Taking this as inspiration, he rose up and beat his opponent. Then 2 more Spartans won fights that were seemingly going the other way, turning the score around to 8-7. Then with the pressure firmly on, the Spartans managed to win one last fight, claiming the prize and saving their blushes. And while that's an interesting story, it raises another. Why does Herodotus tell us that the Spartans accepted the challenge in the first place? Well, to answer that, we can look at the geography of the region. You see, the altar had actually been taken from Sardis to a temple in the city of Delphi, which lay right in the middle of the Spartan domain. So it was actually the Spartans who had taken control of the altar, and they held it for dear life. In fact, we know that the Spartans wanted to avoid war with the Syrians so badly that they tried to bribe them with a huge amount of silver, probably around 300 talents. But UTT refused to accept it, saying that he would rather win the contest. Now, I don't know if he genuinely thought he could win, but there is a chance he simply didn't care. After all, if the Spartans were defeated, they would have to pay 100 talents of silver, which would be enough to hire another 2,000 mercenaries. And that would be more than enough to plunder the wealth of Laconia and take back the altar with them. So maybe UTT was never planning on paying back the Spartans anyway. And if that's the case, then the Spartans may have been tricked into fighting the Battle of Plataea. However, the other major power backing the Persian side were the Egyptians, and they boast a force of 1,500 infantrymen and 50 horsemen. And like the Syrians, their origins lay far from the shores of Greece. According to Herodotus, they came from a place called Tema, and they were invited to invade Greece by none other than the Spartans. That's right. The Spartans asked the Egyptians to come and invade their neighbor's territory. And there must have been a pretty good reason for doing so, because inviting foreigners to fight in Greece was generally forbidden by an ancient law known as the guest freeze. But to understand their logic, we have to look at the situation from their point of view. You see, for centuries, the Spartans had seen the Corinthians as a rival power. Not only did they compete with Sparta in nearly every field imaginable, but they also blocked Sparta's access to the sea. And so tensions between the two city-states were always high. But now Sparta had an opportunity to end that once and for all, because just as they were preparing to invade Corinth, news came that the Persians were gathering a massive army in nearby Boeotia with the intention of marching on the isthmus and cutting off Corinth's lifeline to the rest of Greece. So the Spartans decided to kill two birds with one stone, hiring the Egyptians to wage war on Corinth, while at the same time sending out heralds throughout Greece calling for help against the Persians. And it worked, sort of. The Spartans got plenty of reinforcements, but unfortunately, so did the Corinthians. Now, these Corinthians were also not happy about the Persian occupation of Boeotia, and they were especially concerned for their ally Plataea, who had sent an embassy asking for help. But since the Spartans had been the ones to call for reinforcements, they answered both the Corinthian and the Plataean calls for help. So as you can see, things get a bit complicated when you start looking at the motivations for fighting the battle. So, who had the most important role at Plataea? Well, strictly speaking, the Spartans did. They were the ones who put together the coalition, and they supplied by far the largest force in the Greek army. Without their elite hoplite force, the rest of the Greeks would likely have struggled to hold their ground against the Persians. But I would argue that the Athenians had the second most important role. You see, while Athens didn't send a particularly large force, their presence was essential in turning a local conflict into a pan-Hellenic one. Many Greek city-states only joined the fight to protect their allies, and Athens was by far the most popular and influential city in Greece. So without Athenian support, I doubt the Spartans would have been able to muster such a large force. And to be fair, Sparta knew this as well, and that's why they paid so much for Athenian food. By paying Athens, Sparta reduced the chances of them backing out, which they would have been very tempted to do considering how little benefit they were getting out of the war so far. So, I would argue that the most important roles at Plataea were played by Sparta and Athens. They were the two most influential powers in Greece, and so they had the most to gain by defeating the Persians. But what do you think? Did I miss anyone? And who do you think had the most important role at Plataea? Let me know in the comments below.